everyone for joining me today, and thank you for the organization for the invitation to speak. So today I'll talk about a view on the economics of the Ethereum roadmap. And I'll start off by introducing myself briefly, then we'll take it a bit more technical and talk about the roadmap as a whole, highlighting the various parts that are important aside from the economics. After that, we'll talk a bit about one part of the roadmap that I've been focusing on mainly. And finally, we'll go a bit into how, as a student, you can contribute to this field and how you can start your own journey. So first of all, I'm Julian. I'm a research scientist at the Robust Incentives Groups, which is a part of the research team of the Ethereum Foundation, or the EF for short. We basically study the economics of Ethereum very broadly. So anything that you can think of relating to economics in Ethereum, such as staking economics, the transaction fee mechanism, which determines how much gas fees you need to pay for your transaction to be included on chain, the interaction between applications that exist on Ethereum and the protocol of Ethereum itself, and the economics of consensus and whatever you can think of, basically. So I joined the EF in 2022 as a research assistant next to my undergraduate studies in econometrics and economics in the Netherlands. So if you want to talk about this a bit more of how you can contribute to the EF as a student, we can do so at the end. I started full-time in September of 2023, and my main research interests are inclusion lists, MEV or proposer builder separation, and these are the two technical topics that we'll talk about today, and the interaction between the application layer and the protocol layer. And this is what I wrote my last paper about. So if you want to talk about this, we can do so at the end in the question section maybe, and I'd love to. Okay. So without further ado, we'll get into more of the meat of the presentation. And first we'll talk about the roadmap as outlined by Vitalik. And Vitalik is obviously a very influential person in the ecosystem, but his will is not necessarily the will of everyone. So take this as his personal view that I'll try to present here as well as possible. It doesn't mean that all of this will be incorporated into the Ethereum protocol eventually, and it doesn't mean that everyone actually agrees with this view. So there are lots of individuals who are contributing to the core development of Ethereum, and they have vastly different views on many topics. So see this as just one of those views. And if you want, you can scan this QR code here so you can follow along with the slides on your personal device if you prefer this to do so. Just 1 second for if anyone wants to do so. And otherwise, we'll move on. So the roadmap consists of 5 urges, as they're called. And all of these urges are basically silos of development in which different parts of the protocol are expanded or improved or reflected on. And all of these silos, they happen in parallel. So different people are working on different parts of the roadmap. And the idea is that eventually Ethereum will be complete and the roadmap is complete. And the protocol is also valid. So there shouldn't be any changes anymore to the protocol after some point in time. What I'll do now is I'll go through all of these urges separately and briefly introduce them, and then highlight some of the main ideas that are behind the roadmap. So first of all, the merge. And some of you may wonder why the merge is on here, because what the merge is about our consensus system, so about proof of stake. And you may know that proof of work was the consensus mechanism that Ethereum had before, and we actually transitioned to proof of stake. And you can see this in the top left of the screen, or I don't know if it's top right maybe for you, but you can see that the merge has all full green blocks, which means that it has been completed. And you see that in other parts of the roadmap, there are either white blocks or blocks that are half white, half green, or some variation in between. And green means completed and white means not started. But the merge is actually not complete. You can see the part of the roadmap that is the merge as a continuation of the proof of stake mechanism. And there are some adjustments that we still want to make. For example, we would love to have single slot finality, which means that we achieve economic finality, which means that there is a certain amount of stake backing your transaction so that it can't be reverted anymore within a single slot, whereas we only achieve it in 2 epochs, which is 64 slots now. So this would be a huge improvement to the proof of stake system. And in general, the merge is about making proof of stake more sustainable. Then we have the surge, which is the second urge, the second column row, as you may see. And this is all about data availability for Ethereum. So the Ethereum scaling roadmap is what we call the rollup-centric roadmap. which means that we have rollups, which are blockchains that basically use Ethereum for settlement, and specifically they use a lot of data availability. So the search is all about making Ethereum as well suited to provide this resource to rollups at as low of a cost as possible and with as many transactions as possible. Then there's the scourge, and the scourge is all about how do we deal with the long-term implications and the reality of sophisticated agents in the Ethereum protocol who try to profit, who may not follow the instructions of the protocol as they are designed to do. And how do we prevent centralization in this aspect? The scourge is what we'll talk about more today. So we'll move on to the verge for now. The verge is about making verifying blocks as easy as possible, even when creating blocks is quite heavy. So as we see in the surge, we want to have lots of transactions per second. However, we still want that verifying blocks is super, super easy. And this is somewhat of an asymmetrical situation. We need to make sure that there are people who can expend a lot of energy, a lot of effort to be able to create the blockchain. However, verifying should still be super easy so that it's trustless to see whether your transaction has actually happened, or it's trustless to see that your balance, for example, is still actually what's being reflected on Etherscan. In the verge, we have virtual trees as the main object, and there's also lots of zero-knowledge tech that's leveraged in here. Then we have the purge, and the purge is about eliminating tech debt, about simplifying the protocol to make sure that it runs as fast and as smoothly as possible. And finally, there's the splurge, which is like everything else. So all of the more maybe nice to have features that don't really fit in anywhere else. And you can think of them of a good example is, for example, ERP 1559 and improvements to this Ethereum improvement proposal. ERP 1559 is the transaction fee mechanism that Ethereum uses. So it determines how much you need to pay in order to get your transaction on chain. So it determines the gas fees. And this is not super crucial to scaling, for example. How exactly you pay your gas fees via which mechanism doesn't improve how much transactions we can have per second. However, it's a good UX improvement. And there are more improvements to be had here that aren't crucial to the roadmap, but are definitely good to have. So you can see that throughout the roadmap, there are various parts where blocks are still completely white, some blocks are full, and some blocks are half full. So you can see that development happens in parallel on all of these urges. Okay. So now to highlight two of the most important parts of the roadmap for the rest of this presentation. We'll start with the thread on super light block verification. So as I mentioned in the Verge, the idea is that even though creating blockchains is difficult and costs lots of energy, we want to be able to ensure that verifying what actually happens on the blockchains is super light, so that verification is still trustless. This happens in the Verge. This happens in the Purge with state expiry, which basically means that the amount of data that you need to carry as a node at home decreases. And this happens in the Scourge with EPVS, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Another very important thread for this presentation is censorship resistance. And in my opinion, this is one of the most important aspects that Ethereum has. It's basically the unique selling point of Ethereum is that we want to be the most censorship resistant blockchain out there. And this means that anyone who has a transaction and is willing to pay the fee that's necessary to go on chain should be able to go on chain eventually rather sooner than later. This is done by having a decentralized validator set and also by having distributed validators, which is a part of the merge. It's done by having EPBS in the Scourge, inclusion lists in the Scourge, and both of these topics we'll talk about. It's done by having solutions to centralization in staking. And it's done by having distributed block building. So keep in mind that we need censorship resistance in order to fulfill the promises of Ethereum, basically. And we need to have live block verification to be trustless. And these two core tenets of Ethereum are realized by basically the entire roadmap as a whole. So there's a lot of work to be done. And this is the work of the protocol designers, which is also my job. So now we'll dive a bit deeper into the Scourge specifically. And we'll talk about some of the topics that we mentioned before. Before I go into this, let's maybe take a second, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask Joe. I'm not sure if that's possible with the current setup. But yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Joe.
Yes, it's fine. I can forward questions if there's any, so I can just hear from the crowd. And no questions so far? Okay, no questions so far.
Perfect. Then we'll dive into the scourge. And for this part of the presentation, I used a few images that my teammate Barnabé made for a post. And I've indicated this with a little scroll with a B. So these images are from his post, and I would definitely encourage you to read it if you find the presentation interesting. So we start off with the Ethereum protocol, which is basically just some guy. It existed. It had lots of great plans. It wanted to make the world a trustless and great place, but it couldn't do so alone. So it had to employ some of its earthly entities, which are called validators, and it had to assign certain rights to it. So these validators are basically people at home. It could be you or me who have a computer and have some capital to put at stake, and they enter a contract with the Ethereum protocol, saying that if they do something wrong, they will be punished for it, and if they do something right, they'll get rewards. And what exactly the rules are for doing wrong and right are captured in the Ethereum protocol, and exactly what the rewards are also captured in there. So the Ethereum protocol originates these rights of proposing blocks, which is basically, if we talk about the blockchain, adding another block to the chain. And these blocks contain all of the transactions that are necessary to contribute to the chain. What the protocol wanted validators to do is to order transactions in descending order of transaction fee. I try to show this with an image here. So we can see the protocol block, which has transactions and transactions. And what it does is it sees a set of transactions and it needs to fill the block. What it will do is the first transaction, who pays a fee of 9 in this case, is at the top, and the second transaction pays a fee of 6, and so on, ordering transactions as they are supposed to be done by the protocol. However, some validators that we'll refer to as greedy validators attempted to maximize profits. And what they saw is actually that this ordering that the protocol asked them to do isn't enforced. So they could order in a different way if they prefer. And in fact, that they can make more profits if they do order in some other way. So the idea here is that validators have the right to build a block. So what they can also do is they can insert transactions, they can order transactions, or they can censor transactions however they would like. So what we see in a greedy block is maybe that the first transaction, who doesn't actually pay a single ETH in fees, is still at the top. And this may be the case because the validator inserted their own transaction here, who may be able to get some more value out of them than actually putting a transaction there that pays fees. So for example, if the validator knows that on the Ethereum blockchain, he can access some DeFi application, for example, where there's some value to be had by being first, it can insert this transaction and thereby make some money, more money than it would get from following the honest guidelines and sorting transactions in descending order of transaction fee. Then we see that the last transaction actually has a higher tip than the second transaction. And this could be the case, for example, because someone wants to be at the end of the block so that they can act on all of the information that has happened during the block. So there are lots of examples of this. And the idea is basically that whatever the protocol wants validators to do, they may not actually do so because they aren't forced to do so, and they can make more profits by doing it another way. So this actually is a huge problem for the protocol, as the protocol needs decentralized validators in order to uphold censorship resistance, again, one of the core tenets of Ethereum. But extracting the MEV is very difficult. So MEV is the maximum extractable value, which is the value that validators can get if they are greedy and they insert, censor, or reorder transactions as they please. And it's very difficult to find the perfect way to insert or reorder transactions. So what validators, who are earthly entities that don't have many requirements. So as I said, they need to have some capital to put up, and they need to have basically like a computer with a Wi-Fi connection. So they aren't very sophisticated. However, extracting MEV is sophisticated. So what they may do is they may enter into some contract with other entities in order to enable them to extract MEV as successfully as possible. And this would mean that there would be centralization of the validator set. So just to recap that, because MEV is very difficult to extract and validators aren't sophisticated, they would work together with some people who are very good at extracting MEV and thereby are able to extract as much as possible, meaning that these people who are very good at it would be making most blocks and maybe even buying most validators so that they can get as much MEV as possible, which means that the validators aren't decentralized anymore because they're only sophisticated entities who build the blocks. To see this maybe in traditional finance, you know that there are high frequency trading shops, and they're very good at doing arbitrage, for example, in traditional finance. And arbitrage also exists, of course, in blockchains. And it's no different that you need sophistication to do so. So you could imagine that eventually blockchain would only be built by high frequency trading shops, which obviously is very, very centralized and not what we want. So the Ethereum community was challenged with making a solution to this. And the solution that's proposed and being implemented currently is called proposer-builder separation. And what it does is it splits the role of block production into building a block and into proposing a block. So the idea is that building a block is very difficult, as we just talked about. However, proposing the block, which is basically like broadcasting it to the network and verifying that it is indeed correct. So here you see again the asymmetry between building a block and verifying a block is very easy. So the latter is very easy. So what we do is we introduce a specialized class of actors called builders who ensure that the first part of the block production process goes smoothly and well for validators. And we ensure that every single validator can outsource block construction to builders while still proposing blocks themselves. So what we recognize here is that that validators would outsource block construction to builders, and this would lead to centralization. However, what we do now is we create a marketplace for builders to be able to outsource block construction to, for validators to be able to outsource block construction to builders via a decentralized marketplace, basically, which means that anyone can have access, not only those validators that have contracts with other parties, or maybe only validators that are in the US or whatever you could imagine. And builders pay the proposer to obtain the right to build the execution block. And the execution block is basically the set of transactions and in which order they are ordered. So now every validator, regardless of the sophistication, has access to the same MEV extraction capabilities and thereby preventing centralization of the validator set. And this is the core idea of PBS that we'll dive into more now. So what we have now is instead of only the Ethereum protocol who gives rights to validators, we have that the Ethereum protocol gives right to validators, yet the validator splits up the proposing rights into actually proposing the block and building the block. And the validator gives the execution building rights to builders. And as you see, the builders are positioned under the validators here, and there's no direct connection between the Ethereum protocol and builders. And this is because the Ethereum protocol isn't actually aware of the role of builders currently. So validators have some stake that they put up with the protocol, some capital on which they could be punished if they do stuff incorrectly. However, builders have no such role. Builders don't have any stake with the protocol, and the protocol doesn't know that these builders exist because it just has a contract with the validators. And we'll see that this is problematic for a number of reasons. So proposer-builder separation is somewhat counterintuitive. We say that it's a problem when there's a centralized creation of blocks. However, what we then do is we allow all validators to create their blocks centralized via sophisticated entities to extract as much MEV as possible, instead of just seeing what happens, basically. So it's very counterintuitive that this somehow should ensure that we have censorship resistance, which is, again, the goal. In this part of the presentation, I'll try to convince you that indeed proposer-builder separation does achieve a higher level of censorship resistance than Ethereum would have without it. And the idea here is that decentralization in the builders is less concerning than centralization in the validators, because the verification is still very light and decentralized, which is one of the roadmap goals, the asymmetry between verifying and creating. And we can ensure censorship resistance with other tools than the tool of creating the execution part of the block. And these two ideas are first presented by Vitalik in the Endgame post, which is a great post for if you'd like to read about it more, and it's become very influential in this space. So proposer-builder separation is a planned part of the Ethereum roadmap, And for the very, very attentive people who saw the roadmap just now, it's not completely green yet. And this means that proposer builder separation isn't actually in protocol. However, some community members recognized that we need to have some interim solution before proposer builder separation is enshrined, because enshrining upgrades in the protocol can take a long time. The method that they come up with is called MEV boost, and it's very similar to proposer builder separation, except it's an out-of-protocol middleware instead of in-protocol, and it allows proposers to auction off the right to build the block to the highest paying builder.
Hey, Julian, sorry, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on what enshrining mean?
Yeah, good point. So the Ethereum protocol is basically a set of rules and processes that facilitates the interaction between various parts. So it facilitates the interaction between users sending transactions and validators making blocks. And all of the rules that are actually in the protocol, so that the protocol enforces with validators, are part of the protocol. And those that are not are out of protocol. And all of the rules that are part of the protocol we call enshrined. So for example, as I mentioned before, the specific ordering policy of ordering transactions based on descending order of gas fee is not part of the protocol, so this wouldn't be enshrined. But if we would enforce some rule, which it turns out is very difficult or impossible to do, and we would put this in the protocol and we would say, if validators do not do this, then they get slashed, for example, that would be enshrining. And in the case of proposer builder separation, this would mean that that the protocol recognizes the builder as an entity. So you would see some arrow from the protocol to the builder, meaning that the protocol knows that these builders exist, for example. And this is currently not the case, but that would be the case if proposer builder separation would be enshrined, if that's clear enough.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Nice. If you have any more questions, it's perfect to interrupt. Thank you. So what MEV boost does is it's out of protocol, so not enshrined, and it allows proposers, who are the validators, who partition their duties into proposing and building blocks, to communicate with builders, and it does so via a relay. So the idea here is that the proposer tells a relay, which is basically like an auctioneer, I'm willing to sell my block to the highest paying bidder. Then the relay queries all the builders that are related to it and ask them to bid. And the builders will try to do their best and make a block that extracts as much MEV as possible. And they'll bid in order to get their block included on chain. So they're bidding for the building rights. And then eventually, when the proposer does indeed have to propose their block, what they'll do is they'll go back to the relay and they say, okay, you run this auction for me. Please forward me the highest paying bid, and I'll sign this. I'll sign that indeed I'll give this person who pays me the most money the right to build the block. And then the relay, who received both the block from the builder and the highest paying bid, once it receives the signed bid from the proposer, the relay will open the block that the builder has created and forward it to the rest of the network. So the relay here is an essential role, facilitating the fair exchange between the proposer, who wants to receive some money for selling its building rights, and the builder, who's willing to pay some money for selling the building rights. And the exact fair exchange that we have here is the proposer demands the builder's payment unconditionally of whatever happens. So it doesn't, for example, want that it signs the builder's bid, but then the builder says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not willing to bid anymore. I retract my offer. This shouldn't be possible. And the builder demands that once the proposer has indeed signed the bid, it will get delivery of the building rights. So not that the proposer could, for example, sign another bid or say you have to pay more or whatever. The relay solves this fair exchange, and there's literature on that it's not possible to solve the fair exchange without this trusted third party. But here's the problem. This relay is indeed a trusted party. Both the proposer and the builder trust the relay to enforce this fair exchange, and if anything happens, the relay should be responsible for it. Because it's a trusted entity, it's also very centralized, meaning that it might censor. So because it's centralized, there are only a few entities, and these entities are often based in, for example, the US. So they're responsible to act according to the US law. This is a problem because they could censor indeed. And the final problem with relays is that it's very costly to run. So running this auction may sound simple, but we've seen now that builders become very, very sophisticated. So they would send updated bids and updated blocks. I don't know exactly how often, but like very, very often. So the relay needs to have a very large bandwidth to be able to receive all of these blocks, and it needs to verify that indeed they are correct. And it needs to be super, super quick in order to forward blocks between the builders and the proposers. Yet the relay doesn't really have any revenue. So you may see that in traditional economics, for example, auctioneers take parts of the revenue from the auction, or they add some extra fees. Relays and MethBoost do not do this because of competition, basically. There are a few relays, and these relays will charge 0 fees. So if a relay were to begin charging fees, nobody would use this relay anymore, as we could just simply go to another relay who doesn't charge any fees. And so there's sort of a tragedy of the commons element here, which means that relays are operating at a huge loss. And we have seen some relays shutting down, meaning that relays get even more centralized and there are fewer entities doing so. And enshrined proposer builder separation is aimed at solving this problem because it means that relays will be taken over by the protocol. The fair exchange between the proposer and the builder will be done by the protocol instead of by some trusted entity, and that is the relay. So MethBoost launched just after the merge. And what you see here is a chart that shows the adoption of MethBoost over time. So on the y-axis is the percentage of validators that use MethBoost, and on the x-axis is time. And we see that the orange part is validators that do use MethBoost, and the blue part is vanilla builders. And vanilla builders are people that adhere to the protocol demands of ordering transactions in descending order of transaction fee. We see that after the merge, adoption of MethBoost very, very quickly went up to almost 90% as it is now. So it's been quite stable for a long time. And so there are about 10% of block builders who are still building blocks themselves, and 90% of block builders who use this market to gain more fees, to gain more MEV and thereby more welfare. And it's not that crazy that builders do this or that validators do this. So this is a chart that where the red part is vanilla block building or local block building. On the y-axis on the left is how many local blocks were built to construct this chart, and on the y-axis on the right is MethBoost blocks, which is the blue part. The x-axis is a bit weird, but this image still shows that the rewards from building your blocks with MethBoost are far, far higher than the rewards from building your block locally. In fact, it's about 5 times as profitable. So your expected value from building with MethBoost is 5 times your expected value of actually building your block yourself. And the lowest value MethBoost blocks are still worth more than the median locally built block. So this is maybe an argument that indeed, if we would not have proposer builder separation, validators would try to find a way to access this 5 times more rewards for basically the same work. Or even less work because they don't have to construct their block in some other way. So this could be an argument to be made that even if MethBoost were not a thing, validators would try to find some other way. So for example, co-locating with sophisticated entities to extract this MEV, because there are very, very high rewards to be gained by doing so. So MethBoost has the obvious downside that we discussed earlier as well, which means that builders are more centralized. And we observe this currently as well. So these are pie charts of the market share measured by amounts of blocks that are proposed by a builder and relays over the past 14 days. On the left are relays and on the right are builders. I'll start with the builders. We see that there are 3 entities who are responsible for creating the vast majority of blocks in Ethereum, and that there's one entity who even controls 44% of the market share. So this means that it proposes 44 out of 100 blocks, basically. And with the relays, this is a sort of a similar picture. we see that there are 2 relays who control more than 50% of the market share, and there are only a few relays that are actually big. And this is difficult to deal with because it means that if one of these entities were to be hit, for example, with censorship by a government, so for example, Beaverbuild is in the US, if the US were to sanction certain actions or it would tell Beaverbuild to shut down, this would have a huge market impact on the block building process of Ethereum, which would have a huge impact on the protocol itself. And in fact, we observed something very similar to this. So because of the fragility of the MEV-Boost ecosystem to censorship resistance, and the fact that the United States issued OFAC sanctions against Ethereum addresses, we see that there's a lot of censorship. So as soon as these OFAC sanctions were addressed, many of the builders, like, for example, Beaverbuild, who had the 44% market share, did indeed adhere to the sanctions because they are US-based entities, so they must. So we see now that about 60% of the builders are censoring, about half of the relays are censoring, and about 7% of validators are censoring. So this is somewhat of a grim outlook. Of course, we would prefer for all of these censoring percentages to be 0, but this is not the case currently. The only positive part that I see here is that only 7% of validators are censoring. And if we assume that all United States-based validators do indeed adhere to OFAC sanctions and therefore are censoring, this figure implies that their validators are very distributed. So we do indeed have a decentralized validator set because all of these 92% of validators are not censoring. So they must be somewhere else than in the US. And indeed, there's evidence to show that validators are very decentralized. So this is something that we can be happy with.
How can you be sure that validators are like not censoring for this reason, not maybe because it's too hard to apply censorship? Like, do you have custom clients with censorship lists, for example, or is it really a simple thing to opt in into censorship, or do they have to do some manual arrangements to make this work?
Yeah, good point. So it's not easy to manually censor. I believe there are custom clients that do censorship, but I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. But the main point that it shows is, for example, if a US-based entity is making validators themselves, they must censor. So if a large US-based entity would do so, and this is not the case for smaller stages. But indeed, it's difficult to see whether validators are indeed completely censoring. But there are other websites that show where validators are based on their activity. So you can see that validators are indeed distributed over the entire globe, which means that we do have a somewhat decentralized validator set. That answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Nice, thanks. So then we get to the part where we question whether PBS achieves its goals. The idea of PBS is to ensure that we have decentralized validator sets in the presence of complicated MEV extraction techniques. Even though there is a lot of centralization and censorship now, which makes PBS look bad, I believe it's not so clear-cut, and the conclusion depends on the counterfactual that you use. So the pessimistic case for PBS is the counterfactual where the validator set that we have currently with PBS is the same as the validator set that we would have without PBS or without MEV-Boost. So this basically assumes that validators would not be willing to co-locate with other sophisticated entities to extract more MEV, and they do so now because it's so easy to do. So there is probably some truth to this, that because it's so easy now, more validators are willing to work together with MEV extracting companies to build their blocks. However, I try to convince you with, for example, the reward heterogeneity, where the rewards from using MEV-Boost are about 5x that of locally building. That's indeed some validators would probably try to find MEV extraction capabilities elsewhere if MEV-Boost were not available. And also because MEV-Boost has such a high adoption, 90% currently, I think it's reasonable that some validators at least would find MEV extraction capabilities outside of MEV-Boost if it were never launched. Then the optimistic case for PBS is that the validator set without PBS is the same as the current builder set. So the current builder set, as we saw before, consists of 3 entities who make by far the most amounts of blocks. And I think this is, there may be too little evidence for this as well. So we see that there are some validators who do not adopt MEV-Boost, even though there are many rewards to be gained. So some people are willing to stake and build blocks locally without connecting to builders. So they would not be willing to co-locate if PBS were not a thing. And of course, because MEV-Boost exists, it's way easier for these builders to gain market share. So maybe the market would have looked very, very different. So to see whether PBS actually achieved its goals or not, it's not so simple, and you need to make a correct counterfactual. And this counterfactual is somewhat fuzzy because, of course, we do not observe this counterfactual currently. So whether you think PBS is a success or a failure is up to you to some extent. What we see in PBS, though, is that there is a lot of censorship, as we saw. And I promised at the beginning of the talk that there should be like some censorship resistance magic that Vitalik talked about in his endgame post. That would mean that even if we have centralized block building, we can still get the censorship resistant network. So that's what we'll talk about now. So if there are any more questions about PBS or about MEV, please do say so. I'll just take a minute for that. All good?
Maybe can you do some examples of MEV extraction, because like the level here is a bit mixed, so maybe some people are not familiar with what we mean by value extraction here.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the clearest example, I think, is arbitrage between a decentralized exchange and a centralized exchange. So we see that there are many centralized exchanges that operate similarly as in traditional finance. So they operate in continuous time, and there's a lot of liquidity, and people find the correct price during this continuous time. And then we have Ethereum, which operates in discrete time, meaning that prices are only updated every 12 seconds. So if you see prices being updated continuously off-chain and prices only updated every 12 seconds on-chain, it's logical that there's some deviation between the price that's quoted on-chain and the price that's quoted off-chain. And therefore, people can come in and, for example, if the price on-chain is higher than the price off-chain, what they can do is they can sell on-chain to get the price to the off-chain price, and then buy again on-chain in order to make these prices converge. So basically, if there's a price discrepancy, you can make these prices converge by acting on both markets. And this is risk-free because you can immediately sell your assets on the other market, so you don't have any risk that the price of the assets will change. And this is so like the risk-free profit that you can get by the price deviation between these two markets is what we call arbitrage. And this is one of the largest parts of MEV. So because there is a lot of liquidity on Ethereum that's quoting prices that are 12 seconds old, you can arbitrage against the prices every 12 seconds. However, making the perfect arbitrage is quite difficult because you need to be fast. You need to know what the price is on, for example, Binance within the last millisecond or something in order to be as risk-free as possible to execute your transaction on-chain. And maybe to be competitive, you need to have some way to execute on Binance very cheaply. So it's some entities on Binance have lower cost than others because, for example, they have contracts with Binance that if they trade a lot, they'll get lower prices. So this means that MEV extraction is quite difficult and it belongs to like a centralized class of agents that we call the builders here. There are many other examples of MEV, but I think this is a relatively clear one.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to speed up through this bit because of time. But an important part here is censorship isn't binary. So it's not like we are either censorship resistant or we're fully censored. There are two different types of censorship that are very important here. So we have weak censorship, which means that censored transactions temporarily do not go on-chain, but they will go on-chain eventually. So this is bad because we don't want censored transactions to have to wait, but it's not that bad because they'll get on-chain eventually. And then there's strong censorship, which means transactions will never get on-chain. And the idea is that with a decentralized validator set, and with some people still locally building or using censorship resistance magic, weak censorship can be leveraged to become more censorship resistant. However, if the validator set were centralized, it would be super difficult to return back to a decentralized validator set, and we basically have strong censorship. So there are multiple ways to obtain censorship resistance, and these are very well spelled out in the talk that I took this slide from by Justin Drake, who's also at the Ethereum Foundation. But for the remainder of this talk, we'll focus on inclusion lists, which are proposed to be implemented or enshrined into the protocol relatively soon. So to explain inclusion lists, we'll recap a bit. In the beginning, there was just the protocol who relied on the decentralized validators to uphold censorship resistance, one of its core goals. Then Mev Boost broke this because block production became centralized by builders, and we saw that 90% of validators indeed outsourced their block construction, so it's a very centralized process. The levels censorship increased drastically. Inclusion list is, I think, the logical response in that they try to leverage the decentralized validator set to uphold censorship resistance by allowing a validator to have some input in block production. And specifically, we allow a validator to construct a list of transactions that must be included in the block in some way. So the basic idea here is that a validator does indeed outsource their construction to a specialized agent. However, when it does so, it tells this agent, okay, you can build my block. However, you must include at least these transactions. And these transactions then could, for example, be censored transactions. Building inclusion lists is a relatively simple idea, but actually incorporating it or enshrining it is more complicated. This is the case because there are many variants of them, and we need to trade off their pros and cons. So spot means that the validator of the current block tells its own builder that it has a contract with, please include these transactions that I included in my inclusion list. An advantage of this would be that there wouldn't be any delay to censored transactions getting included. However, we know that rational proposers would not be willing to restrict themselves. So if your proposer tells if your proposer tells the builder, you can solve an optimization problem, but I'm giving you some constraints, then the optimal value from this optimization problem will always be lower than the optimal value of the optimization problem without the constraints. So a rational proposer who's greedy and trying to get as much value as possible would never constrain itself. So therefore, spot inclusion lists are not a viable option. And we moved to forward inclusion list, which means that the proposer of the current block creates an inclusion list, but this doesn't apply as a restriction to its own block. It applies as a restriction to the next block. And so, for example, you can create an inclusion list for the person sitting next to you, and you don't care about it that much because it's not about the rewards that you yourself gain, it's about the rewards that someone else gains. So your rewards are decoupled from actually creating the inclusion list. And we see now that there's a reason to create inclusion lists because people do want to uphold censorship resistance. However, censored transactions experience a slight delay in inclusion, which may not be good enough for certain applications. Then another design problem with inclusion list is conditional versus unconditional. So the inclusion list design originally was conditional, which means that there is the list of transactions that must be included in the block, but the builder can do with them however they please. So they can insert them wherever in the block they want, basically. And this could induce games where builders could, for example, stuff their block. So if the block is completely full, the inclusion list transactions don't actually have to be incorporated. So maybe the censoring builder is not willing to incorporate transactions, and they'll just stuff their block with as many transactions as they can, just so that they don't have to include the transactions on the inclusion list. And there are other games that are induced by this design. And then there's unconditional inclusion list, which basically means the previous validator has made a list of transactions, and these will just be appended to the block of the next proposer in order that the previous proposer made the list. This has the advantage that once a transaction is in the inclusion list, it will definitely be included. So you don't need to worry about games in that sense. However, there are many unanswered questions, and this is actually an area of research that we're currently diving in. So if it's of interest of you, please reach out in that sense. So what I find really cool about Ethereum is that when you're researching this kind of stuff, there's a very big chance of stuff actually being incorporated. So you have a direct impact in that way. And inclusion lists are no different, and they're currently considered for inclusion, which is like a label that says like how far in the governance process it is, as part of the Pextra hard fork. And the hard fork is a point in time in which Ethereum enshrines certain parts of the planned, for example, roadmap into the protocol. So it upgrades the Ethereum protocol with a new set of rules during a hard fork. And the proposed specifications are forward, unconditional, and 3 million units of gas, which is about a tenth of the gas limit of a normal block. So there would be like a tenth of the normal block would be reserved for censored transactions via the inclusion list. And whether or not inclusion lists are actually incorporated via this ERP and whether they're incorporated in Petra or not, work on inclusion lists will definitely continue. And this has been one of the things that my research team, the Robust Incentive Group, has been focusing on a lot. So one of my teammates wrote a post called Fun and Games with Inclusion List, which is about games that are induced, games as in game theory. I wrote a post about how inclusion lists may be used for other means than for censorship resistance. And there are proposals to make inclusion list committee-based, so that every member in the committee votes for which transactions should be included. And this larger scheme of mechanisms where proposers have some input in how blocks are constructed is what we call block code creation, and is a main focus of us for the next few months. So that was all for the technical part. We'll quickly go to how to get more involved now. And also not sure how we're doing on time, so we started a bit later. Is it fine if we just continue to like 10 or 15? Yeah, I'll be quick through this, and then we can have some time for questions as well. Okay, yeah, tell me.
Maybe if you could try to wrap this up in like 5 minutes. I know I'm asking for a lot, but yeah,
Yeah, no, that's fine.
5, 10 minutes. Yeah.
I'm almost done with my slides. It's just I can stay on a bit longer for questions if there are any.
Okay, thanks.
So how to get involved? I think this is a very interesting question because it wasn't clear to me when I start to get involved. But crypto really is a culture of just start contributing, start attending, start doing, and then it's very easy to get involved. So there are many accessible ways to do so. And I actually did so by volunteering at an event in Amsterdam because I'm based in the Netherlands. I was a volunteer there for a number of days, and that's where I met my current boss. Afterwards, we chatted a lot. We went through some papers together, and I started an internship, and eventually that's how I went full time with Ethereum. So volunteering or attending events is really, really great, and really you shouldn't underestimate that. Then there's also like reading research posts and just leaving comments. And it's really cool that you can be discussing research with like some amazing professor who in general are very open to contribute. And you can contribute to open source projects. So I heard that some of you are more into computer science and into economics, which this presentation has been about. So there should be loads of open source projects that you can contribute to. And if you're more into research, our team, the RIG, has some open problems in which we we describe a problem and we ask people to contribute in order to solve or get somewhere ahead with this problem. And I'll have a link to this in the next slide. But the idea is really, the doors are really, really wide open and you can just start contributing and doing so. Unlike in traditional companies where maybe the hiring process is more formal. So here's a list of useful references, and you don't have to write them down. But yeah, definitely go through them if you want to get more involved. And that was it for me. So you can scan this QR code if you'd like to see the slides. So you can also see the links. And yeah, I'd love to take any questions if there's still time. And thank you for your interest. Thanks.
Okay. Any last question before we move?
Yeah, I mean, what are currently the ideas on like the committee which will decide which transaction should be inside the inclusion list?
Yeah.
Already some some ideas about this.
Yeah, so the idea is that not all validators will be willing to make inclusion lists. So for example, censoring validators would not be willing to put censored transactions into an inclusion list because they are censoring, of course. And maybe greedy validators, so people who are just trying to get the most money out of it, wouldn't actually make inclusion lists to include censored transactions, but they'll sell like the extra block space that they can get to achieve more profit, which is the subject of my last post. So the committee-based inclusion list tried to prevent this by saying that a transaction has to be included in the inclusion list from at least 10% of committee members, so that people can't just insert their own transactions and fill up the inclusion list with transactions that aren't actually censored. And also, if some members would be censoring, then only 10% of committee members need to be honest and actually include censored transactions for them to be included on chain. So the idea of the committee-based is to be a bit less dependent on what type of proposer is actually creating the inclusion list, just because we have more.
Okay, I see the correlation between the 10% here and the 10% of vanilla builders, vanilla stakers.
Yeah. That's correct. Yeah, this is why it's so important to have the decentralized validator set, because then we can use these censorship resistance magic tools like inclusion lists. If the validator set were censoring or centralized, we wouldn't be able to use them. So that's why it's like so important to have that for us.
Thank you very much. So I think there are no further questions. Just wanted to show you the room before we end, but thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you guys for attending, and thank you for the organization.